I think that a lot of the literature does suggest that worker productivity is very closely tied with compensation. But, you know, the argument that we had, I believe that it varies from industry to industry, and where exactly that worker productivity is coming from.
Productivity is a very relative measure when we're talking about like the worth of the goods produced, in large part because the worth of goods can be determined by a number of extrinsic factors that don't necessarily relate to the level of development within a given like system. So for example, like things like regional exclusivity, things like local labor laws or the local minimum wage, things like the trade relations with other countries or exploitative business deals like made for the IMF or the World Bank. These can all affect the perceived value of the production of a given factory or firm in ways that don't actually relate at all to its efficiency in terms of its actual production. When we take a look at like total resources extracted from different parts of the world, there is no, say for example, there's only one cobalt mine in all the world, right? Now that's not true, of course, but say that was the case, and it's somewhere in Sudan, and I don't know. Folks, there ain't going to get paid too much. Now, the world needs cobalt. And no matter how efficiently that cobalt mine mines cobalt, I imagine given the fact that it's the only mine, there would probably be Western businesses making sure they have the highest end technology in doing so. The people who work there ain't going to get paid that much. And technically, if you compare them to the production efficiency of the rest of the world, they're the most efficient producer of cobalt. No one else even comes close. They're the only game in town. But they don't get paid very much for their labor. And the reason for that is because even though in a comparative sense, their efficiency, their productivity is unrivaled in that field, they are in Sudan. And as that's an extrinsic factor unrelated to their efficiency, their productivity in any meaningful sense, they will get paid very little, possibly nothing, even if a firm of the same comparative efficiency could have workers who are paid a tremendous amount if it was in Alaska or, something like that. You know what I mean? That's the only point I was trying to illustrate. There are so many like other things that go into what people are paid, if they're paid their worth, so to speak, than just the productive efficiency of a firm.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, because like studies on worker productivity, they rely on like assumptions that there is at least some semblance of like free market competition, and operating markets here. So like if you go back to like the feudal system, the productivity of workers is like might be very decoupled from their actual wages. Or if you look at like slavery, where people are literally being paid nothing. Yeah, I think that like in sort of these extreme examples where the system is like, a very unique and very especially exploitative, there's decoupling from worker productivity. These extreme systems tend not to be like very sustainable in the long term. So like if you look at like Bangladesh and like sweatshops, even if you're paying like very exploitative wages, if you are paying some wages that allow people to save money and eventually, send their children to college and, have transfer of wealth between generations and accumulation of wealth, what ends up happening is people are more able eventually to advocate for higher wages and to develop skills that allow them to build industries within their countries. And so I think that like the more economically minded people would point out that it's hard to keep like this very exploitative system going on for long unless you have like total control of like violence, and the ability to like really exert force, or like prevent people from moving between industries or control their wealth entirely, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, it's a snowball rolling down a hill situation. Um, a lot of people use like productivity between countries as a measurement of like entrepreneurship or like industry-minded behavior. But, the United States is always going to be more economically productive in any measurable sense than countries with lower levels of development because obviously they don't have the development necessary to produce the stuff that allows them to develop faster. I mean, it's just, it feeds into itself. But people use it like a prescriptive thing, like when people say stuff like, well, the reason people in America are wealthier than people in Africa is because they're more productive. It's a very reductive statement to make. There are a lot of reasons and explanations for that, of course. There are people who have no productive value at all, but are enormously wealthy through inheritance. Yeah, it's not the only factor, but also there's an inherent, like, there's an implied level of sort of prescriptive judgment there, you know, like, well, why is America on top? Well, I guess they're just more productive, you know, even though productivity in an economic sense is self-referential, productivity begets productivity. In a colloquial sense, what people tend to talk about when they say productivity is like workmanship, you know, efficiency, drive, entrepreneurship. And I don't think there's any more or less drive or entrepreneurship in Africa than there is in Europe, you know? Probably, honestly, more of it in Europe, or sorry, in more of it in Africa, and more of a hard workmanship vibe going on in Africa as well, because they're more at threat of death, and they don't have robust welfare states. There might actually be a greater degree of desperate individual, striving for attainment over there, the grind set, if it were, than what you might get from the average European. So the solution, of course, is reinvestiture. You know, it's investment, development. But sometimes people act like the reason they don't have that development is because they're lacking something. That bothers me.
Yeah, I definitely think that, like, colloquially, the way that people use productivity is just to sort of mean like how hardworking someone is. And that's definitely not what economists mean when they use this word, which is like, it's frustrating to talk about because it definitely trips people up in ways that are frustrating.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's just from an economic perspective, the statement, people in this country make less money than people in this country because they're less productive, is like tautological. Because in that case, wages are going to relate to like the internal economic activity, which relates directly to the productivity. It's basically like saying, well, this country has more wealth because it has a higher GDP. It's like, well, yeah, of course, you know, they're right there. Those numbers are very directly connected. But there's obviously other stuff. You could take the same factory with the same workers, you know, in America, and move it on over to Mexico, and they could produce stuff at the same rate. And of course, those people would be paid less. You know, obviously, more goes into this than just efficiency. That's one of the reasons why people's wages vary based on the minimum wage set in different states. If everything was determined exclusively by efficiency or productivity, then that wouldn't be the case. But oh god, I'm remembering when What If Alt History made the claim that baristas who work for Starbucks get paid more if they serve more customers per hour. That was a good one. Anyway, I'm rambling at this point, but yeah, that was a very, very insular moment there.
If I can just like push back a little bit, I would say that like the longer that you work at Starbucks, like, and your ability to retain that job is dependent on your ability to produce coffees at a certain, you know, adequate rate or a high rate. And like that's also correlated with like increasing wages whenever you get your performance reviews. So like there is correlation between how many macchiatos you can make per hour and your wages at Starbucks. It's just the correlation is not necessary. I don't know the numbers. I'm guessing it's not super strong because that portion of productivity only accounts for like a small portion of how fast they're able to make the drinks, and the rest of it is accounted for by capital.
Well, people get raises in most of these service joints by seniority, and even then they're incredibly small, but I don't think there's any correlation to their level of skill. They might get promoted to like front end or back end manager, like closing, shift lead, what, you know, something like that. And that might include a pay raise. I think that would depend on the place, but it could. Though the amount of extra responsibility you're dealing with on account of that is much greater than the amount of extra pay you're going to be getting as well. I don't think the correlation I think is quite weak as well, especially since, you know, the people who are getting paid the most, they're the manager, oftentimes do quite a bit less in terms of like day-to-day work. That depends on the location. Sometimes managers do quite a lot. Yeah, I don't think there's a meaningful correlation there. I think that if you take a look at society as an aggregate, the harder people work, the less they tend to get paid. Because usually it's poor people who have to work multiple jobs, stack up 8 to 10 to 12 hours to work while going to college, stuff like that. The people who make a lot of money don't have to work through their entire lives. And you have exceptions, of course. There are like Sigma grindset lawyers who like sleep underneath their desk. You know, of course there are exceptions. It's not a total thing, just an aggregate average. But that's how hard you work to wages, not productivity to wages. But in terms of productivity, I mean, how do you abstract some of this stuff? What's the productivity of a CEO? They don't produce anything. Sometimes they don't even really make decisions. They just operate as like a front end. It's difficult to economically calculate stuff like this in any meaningful sense, because a lot of these econ evaluations are just like, how many widgets do you make per hour? You know, they're very cut down, very not service economy oriented. Good for like nationwide aggregates, not very good at individual person-to-person determiners of predicted income.
I mean, so like on the CEO level, it's hard to measure because there's not a lot of CEOs and their work tends to be very different. But the way that you would measure it is like how much value they're adding to the company. When you say something that like, you know, the hardest working people tend to be like earning very little. I think that's sort of true. And the reason why it's true is because like productivity is basically how much value you can create per hour work. There are other ways to measure it, but like per hour of work is the typical one. And if you're able to produce a ton of value per hour of work, then yeah, like the reality is you probably don't need to work that much. And so the more productive you are, you know, the more you can get away with not working for super long. In regards to like CEOs, yeah, I mean, it varies quite a lot because different CEOs have different positions in the company, like different responsibilities and different like ownership of the company. So like in theory, the way that it would work is like a board of directors interviews and like hires on a CEO, and they're willing to pay that CEO a certain amount of money, you know, up to potentially the value they create for the company. And so you would probably measure it that way. And you know, how much they actually receive is probably a fairly good metric, especially for CEOs, of how productive they are.
But that's absolutely not true. There's no correlation at all between the compensation a CEO gets and their productivity in the economic sense we're referring to. CEOs, they, even if a company devalues over a given length of time, they still make their pay. Now, devaluing a company through your leadership is a negative contribution. Technically, they're being less productive than the lowest barista underneath them, and they still get paid many, many millions, you know? The tie that a CEO gets to their productivity is in the stock options they receive, increasing in value, you know, what they're paid in. And often CEOs are paid largely in stock options, but the stock value of a company also isn't the same as productivity. When we talk about productivity, we're talking about the actual generated value to others. Tesla has a higher corporate value on the stock market than a bunch of other car companies, but it produces significantly less because the stock market is really, really hype generated. So the issue I have here is I just don't think there's like any correlation at all. I think it's very, very spurious. How hard people work, how productive they are, these are really, really hard to pin down between different fields. At a point, I don't think there's any use, any relevance to this mode of analysis beyond like a really general, like firm or nationwide analysis. When you try to apply it to individuals, you know, I think it falls apart. America on average is more productive than Mexico, and we do make on average more money. But if you get down to the individual, you know, members of both countries, I think you'll find enough variance that it gets really blurry.
So again, it depends on the CEO and what exactly their compensation framework is. So I think in theory, it's possible for a CEO to just take higher and higher compensation rates year after year, even as their company value plummets, right? And they make less money. But if they keep doing that, like eventually the company's going to go bankrupt. So, and eventually the board will fire them. So again, it's like possible that like a CEO, it's totally possible that a CEO controls the majority of the stocks and they just like set all of the policies unilaterally. And they've just decided to like plunder whatever they can from a company as they run it into the ground.
What if they just do a bad job though?
So if they do a bad job, again, you'd expect the board to fire them because the board wants to make money. They're profit motivated. And if a CEO is not returning profits to them, they're not going to like that.
But they would still make tens of millions. Usually there's a golden parachute even after a few years a CEO goes down, which means they would have received tens of millions of dollars for contributing negative perceived productivity, whereas at least the lowest minimum wage earning barista underneath them would have contributed some positive.
Yeah, but the board doesn't want that to happen.
Well,
Like, they
sure,
want to
but
get their
it
money's
happens
worth.
though.
So, like, yeah, you can have happens, or like you can also pay a barista like 1,000 times what you would otherwise, and like lose value on them. Or you could do this with like anyone in the company, where you just like pay them much more than the value they produce. But it would be like a bad deal. The company doesn't want to do this. The board is not incentivized to do this. And so you'd expect, like, on aggregate, them to avoid situations where the CEO just like takes money from them and doesn't deliver value back to the company.
Well, that's common. CEOs get paid a lot, and many businesses go defunct. It happens every year. We hear stories of businesses going down or losing money in a quarter. Their CEOs continue to make lots of money. It doesn't seem like there's any relationship at all between them making a metric fuck ton of money and their productivity in an economic sense. Again, assuming you can even extrapolate productivity to refer to a corporation's evaluation in the stock market, because even then I think that's a very speculative relationship between those two factors. But I just don't think there's a relationship. Whether or not the company goes up or down, the CEO makes a hell of a lot more money than the people beneath them. If it goes down, maybe they don't stay in that position for as long, but they still made millions while contributing negative productivity. It's just a deeply unfair system, but we have to recognize it's unfair to fix it.
I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm inclined to believe that these people are very profit driven and want to generate like as much money as they can. And so they're willing to like, they're not going to want to take like these sort of bad deals.
But it happens anyway.
I do agree that like CEOs fail and companies fail. And like sometimes you can hire someone on with the promise that they're going to generate all of this value and make a bad call ultimately, and they don't generate that value. The board isn't happy. The CEO eventually, you know, when the company fails, is no longer making that money. I just think that like, given the option, if these people could choose, you know, they could see the future, they would choose to make more money.
Well, I'm not denying that. I'm only saying I don't think there's a strong relationship between economic productivity and wages. If they continue to make their wages, millions, while being unproductive, contributing negative productivity, the intentions or will of the stock, of the shareholders isn't really relevant to the, you know.
Gosh, why would a board, like, they don't want that to happen though.
Wait, I'm not saying they want it to happen, only that it does happen. It happens,
does happen.
and when it happens, they still make a lot of money doing it. So there's not a strong relationship between their productivity and the wages they receive.
But you agree that the incentives are for them to create value. Like, everyone wants the CEO to create value. They don't want them to lose value for the company, right?
Yeah, but what they want is irrelevant. We're talking about the relationship between productivity and wages. If there was a strong relationship, CEOs that contribute negative productivity should receive negative wages, or at the very least nothing. But of course it doesn't work that way, because life doesn't work that way. Productivity doesn't chart onto wages, or vice versa.